Hey, what's up guys? I'm Josh, and this is going to be a beginner level video for those who are just getting into this hobby. I'm going to cover a few things like some headphone terminology like open back and impedance and what all those mean and how they affect your headphones. I'm also going to talk about whether or not you need an amplifier, and at the end we're going to have a special guest on to talk at an expert level about some expert level topics regarding headphones. Now I think I'm also going to break this video up into 3 levels. Level 1 is going to be your very basic info. This is going to be your first day type of info. Level 2 is going to be kind of teasing that intermediate range where I'm going to be touching on the very first layer of much deeper topics. And then level 3, we're actually going to be again talking to that expert, but that'll come later. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. So you have 2 basic types of headphones. You have open backs and you have closed backs, and then you have variations in between these. Closed backs are probably your most popular consumer option. Those will kind of block out the world around you, but will also block the audio playing from the headphones from going outside the headphones, especially if you're on like a train or in an office. This is a very valuable addition. When it comes to the flip side, you have open back headphones, which allow audio to kind of freely pass through both directions in and out of the headphone itself. So if you're out in a public environment, you will hear the audio playing a little bit outside of those headphones. This is not really great for being friendly to your neighbors. These are best used in private environments, but they do have some legitimate sonic upgrades over a closed back counterpart. With a closed back, you're working with a closed chamber, and sound has to bounce around in that chamber and has to interact with that chamber before it's actually getting to your ear. With an open back headphone, it does still have somewhat of that problem, but the problem is significantly less than on a closed back headphone. And this allows for the headphone to sound quite a bit more natural in terms of the positioning of the instruments, and things go from being internal to being a little bit more external with an open back headphone. You can almost think of this as sort of a halfway in between a closed back headphone that you might be used to and a pair of speakers. It sort of bridges that gap a little bit. Now I want to talk about driver types. There are 3 main ones you should think about: dynamic drivers, planar magnetic drivers, and electrostatic drivers. Dynamic drivers are going to be your most common, and if you pair that with a closed back headphone, boom, you got the most common headphone that exists on the market today. Though what is perhaps more popular for audiophiles is pairing any one of these drivers with an open back design. Now, dynamic drivers work in a way that you would actually see pretty commonly used on speakers, which is going to be a donut-shaped magnet moving a voice coil back and forth, and that voice coil is attached to a diaphragm that is usually dome-shaped. Planar magnetics are your second most common and a popular choice amongst audiophiles, and are becoming not only cheaper, but also better at lower and lower prices every day, and they're becoming much more popular as time goes on. These work a little bit different, but under the same principles. With a planar magnetic driver, you typically have 2 sets of magnets vibrating a substrate back and forth, which you can kind of think of as like a piece of paper. And within that substrate, you have something called a trace, which is magnetic material that the magnets move, that vibrates the air at certain frequencies, that is delivered to your ear, and that's how you get sound. Electrostatic drivers are very similar to planar magnetic drivers, but go about it in a very different way. But instead of using magnetism, they use static electricity to vibrate a membrane that at certain frequencies is delivered to your ears, so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about electrostatics is that the barrier to entry for cost is actually quite high. They're not very cheap. And in my opinion, they do have some inherent downsides, so they're usually not my top recommendation. They're kind of more nitpicky. They're a much more niche audiophile option and are probably not going to be the way of the future. A lot of people are going to be mad at that one. So what are the best beginner headphones? These are headphones that are much better than the headphones you see from day to day, but don't break the bank for cost. HT6XX is an easy recommendation here. It's got great vocals, a nice, warm, mid-range performance that is surprisingly lacking even at higher prices. This also will encourage you to use and explore amplifiers. The price for this is $220. HE400SE. This is an excellent first planar headphone. It's coming in at the right price point, and it has some quality lows, some quality mids, and some quality highs with some nice additional features like sound staging. The price is $150. SHP 9600s are the cheapest that's coming in at this list. These have wonderful comfort, excellent mid-range for the price, good sound staging, and are actually a really good gaming headphone for the money, even as a main headset. That being said, what I like most about this headphone is it's really versatile and it can fulfill many roles beyond just listening to music, and it can be powered off of a phone or a laptop. The price is $85. Now, one of the first things you will hear about when you're talking about headphones is amplification. And that naturally brings up the question, do you need an amplifier to run with your headphones? This really depends on the headphone, but I want to talk a little bit about what amplifiers do, and then you can decide whether or not you need one. I think the first thing to note is that anything you play with a headphone is going to have an amplifier built into it. That includes your phone, your laptops, and dedicated amplifiers. Even those small little wireless earbuds have amplifiers built into them. It's really the quality and the power of those amplifiers that makes the biggest difference. But what do the amps actually do? To briefly put it, amplifiers use amperage and voltage to kind of push a signal through the headphones to move the diaphragm in various volume qualities and in various movement qualities. There's a whole lot more that can go into amplifiers, but that's basically the gist of it. You can think of this like a car. If a car has a better engine and better brakes, you're going to have more control over that car. An amplifier is a lot like this, where if you have a better amplifier, you're going to have much more control over the driver. Much more control over the driver leads to a more precise sound, and more precise sound is what a lot of audiophiles are seeking. Now, whether or not you need an amplifier really just depends on each and every headphone. There are a couple key specs that you can pay attention to that will tell you whether or not you would want an amplifier, and I'm going to give you a general rule of thumb to go by. But first, we want to talk a little bit about those specs and what they are. So one of the only things that I like to pay attention to on a headphone box, aside from the marketing stuff that's on there, because it's usually just the companies kind of sucking their own, is the specifications. So there's a couple specifications. One is going to show you the frequency response, which is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. This is pretty common and a more intermediate topic that we might talk about in a future video. Then it's going to show the impedance, the efficiency, and the weight. So the impedance is also called the ohms, and it has a little symbol that looks exactly like this. And what this is the amount of electrical resistance that this particular headphone has. Now, when you have higher resistance, you do need higher power to run it, but what is more important and will tell you more definitely whether or not you need an amplifier is the sound pressure level or the sensitivity level or the efficiency. They all mean exactly the same thing, and this is usually rated in decibels per milliwatt. So on this particular headphone, this has an efficiency of 91 dB per milliwatt. And this means that at 1 milliwatt of power, this will output 91 decibels. Now, what's interesting about this one is that unlike impedance, which shows you the higher resistance something is by going up, the higher number for sound pressure level or efficiency, the easier it is to run. Now, your sensitivity on an average pair of headphones is going to run anywhere between 80 dB and 120 dB on the highest end. There are a couple extremes a little bit beyond that, but that's generally what you're going to see. Now, a couple general rules of thumb here. If a headphone has over 100 dB for sensitivity or efficiency or SPL, I think you are good to run it on just about anything, including your modern phones and your modern laptops. Now, an amplifier can still be used if you want to, but the benefits are not really going to be substantial like they might be with a harder to drive headphone where you really want a dedicated amplifier. Now, when it becomes lower than 100 dB, you can see them usually all the way down to 80 dB on the extremes. Those you will want an amplifier to run, and you will get some benefits with running an amplifier. So this one being a 91 dB sound pressure level, I would run an amplifier with this. This is a planar magnetic open back headphone. You're gonna want an amplifier with something like this. Now, I do want to talk about something that is related to headphones, but is more topic-based than hardware-based, and that's going to be distortion. Now, distortion for me is a little bit interesting because I have contradicting opinions even within my own brain about this. Because on one hand, I buy amplifiers and DACs that have incredibly low distortion numbers, but I give almost zero shits about a headphone's distortion number on the side of the box. That is because, in my own experience, when you're listening to two different headphones that both have less than 1% distortion according to the box, you get vastly different sound qualities out of it. And I don't see how they could both be that close to zero distortion and sound so distinctly different. So I don't really care that much about the specs on the actual box of the headphones, but I do think that distortion matters a lot for amps and DACs. But one thing that's notable here is that the distortion numbers on headphones are far higher than the distortion numbers on amps and DACs. So why spend money on really clean distortion numbers for amps and DACs if the headphones are already going to be blowing the distortion numbers out of the water? I think we have to come to terms with one simple fact, and that's that for the time being at least, converting electrical energy to kinetic energy through the driver, that process is going to create a significant amount of distortion rather than keeping a signal purely electrical like most amps and DACs are doing. And I think there's definitely some room for subjectivity here. Like, that's the entire market of tube amplifiers. Those are designed to display distortion in a pleasing way, and headphones can even distort audio in a pleasing way that is not at all precise, and it can sound glorious. So I think every headphone enthusiast and audiophile and audio purist need to determine where their subjectivity and their objectivity need to meet. I think for me, I would like the headphones to have as even of a playing field as possible. I also think for my particular job, it's important for me to have reference quality amplifiers, but as a general consuming buyer, I don't know that that is as important. But the main point being that until we get cybernetics that play audio straight into our brains, I think we're going to be dealing with some level of distortion. I think it's just making up your mind on where and when you want to pick your battles for where you want that distortion to enter the system. For me, I prefer a clean signal all the way up until the end. Okay, then I want to talk about the differences between low-end and high-end sound. This is one of those things that you will not really get until you've heard it. So you want to have a lot of experience with a few different headphones to really understand what I'm talking about. But that's why this is in the intermediate section and not in the beginning section. So I want to talk about some of the things that I pay attention to for a low end versus high end sound. I'm going to use a couple of analogies here just to kind of get some of the beginners who are sticking around for this portion sort of up to speed. So in some real basic ways, I think treble response in a singular word should be glittery. It should be solidified in space, and sparkly and clear, but it shouldn't be calling attention to itself in any negative way. This is something that you should be able to clearly define as present in the sound, and you can hear very clearly, but is not really shining outside of most of the other regions in any particular area. Now, mid-range, I think this one is the most simple, but I also recommend kind of going off of technical precision here and more thinking about it in sort of a slightly different way. And this is sort of the litmus test that I run on just about every headphone for mid-range. And it's very simple. Does it sound like a human? So I feel like when you're listening to a lot of headphones, they're mechanical devices trying to replicate something that sounds organic. And some headphones are very, very good at this, even down to kind of budget headphones like the 6XX sound incredibly natural. They sound incredibly human-like within the vocal range. But some headphones don't. They sound artificial. They sound like a mechanical device trying to sound like a human. And this, for me, is a very apparent line where things become very, very clear on how organic they sound here. And this is something that I would personally stay away from technical analysis on and let instinct kick in. Does it sound like a human? Yes or no? Bass response, I would describe high-end bass as effortless. I think this is the most defining characteristic between all the different bass powers and implementations and shapes and dynamics that you can have in your bass response. I think the sense of effortlessness that the speaker or the headphone is giving is really the kind of difference between the low end and the high end sound here. I think it's fairly easy for low end headphones to create bass, but when you're talking about high end headphone and you're talking about that effortless bass, I would like to bring up a car analogy. So if you're driving a 100 horsepower car and a 400 horsepower car at 40 miles an hour, they're both going the same speed, but there is a very clear sense of ease that the 400 horsepower car has at the same speed as the 100 horsepower car. There's also some key things to pay attention to, things that help with that effortlessness, and that is usually a powerful but clean bass. So not a lot of bloat, not a lot of bleed. All these sort of things kind of come into play when you're talking about a high-end bass sound. Okay, then there is the pizza factor. That's right, the pizza factor. So the pizza factor is, it's a lot like a pizza. So like you've had 100, 200, 300 other types of pizzas before, but a few stand out as being really good. But it's kind of confusing because they're made in generally the same way, with generally the same ingredients, and they should be very consistent, and yet you get this high diversity, and sound is a lot like that. But what makes the difference here is the precise mixture and the quality of the ingredients combined. So it's the cohesive nature of how everything is coming together. This is one thing that, the only way to really talk about this is to talk about specific headphones, unless you really want to get deep into nuance. But to avoid that, it's really how all these things are kind of combined and mixing together that makes a high-end headphone sound like a high-end headphone. If you have high-end bass, but terrible mids and terrible treble, the mixture isn't going to be right and you're not going to get a very high-end sound. So you want to make sure your ingredients and your mixture are precise. Intermediate headphones do have a few benefits over the beginner headphones. Typically, the build is a little bit better. They also, in general, have better sound quality. And this is really where you start to enter that wow factor for your headphones. But they do come at a downside of costing a little bit more and are, kind of a bigger investment than the beginner level stuff. These headphones I consider to be good in every single facet of sound and provide an extremely clear but rich sound. My first recommendation is the Sundara. This is a $350 planar magnetic headphone. This is an excellent planar that actually beats a lot of the things below it, but also competes really well with things above it. And I think for $350, it's a really solid planar option. Beyerdynamic DT1990 Pros. These are a popular choice for studios and people who want to experience the studio sound at home. They're also medium efficiency for difficulty to drive and highly recommended for me personally. You can usually find these from about $500 to $600 depending on when you buy them. The Focal Lex is a wonderful choice for those who want a warm, luxury sounding experience from their headphones. The price of these are $700. Hyphaman Aria. This is one of my favorite personal recommendations because it's got some excellent features for the cost, even though it's fairly expensive. It's got great detail retrieval, excellent dynamics, good sound staging, and excellent depth. Notably, the Aria will require good amplification to run properly. Otherwise, you're really not going to be squeaking out its peak performance. And if you're going to pay this much, you really want that performance. The price is $1,600. Okay, so when it comes to beginner, intermediate, and expert knowledge, I think I'm firmly planted in intermediate. And that's because I think you have to look at the depth and wealth of knowledge that others have that are above you. And when it comes to some legitimate experts in this field, I feel like I know basically nothing. So what I want to do in this section is talk to a legitimate expert. This is going to be Eric, who is the lead engineer of Abyss, which is a headphone company. First question, what is your advice to beginning audiophiles for picking out their first high-end pair of headphones?
Ooh, that's a real doozy. So I think the thing that people get caught up most on that one is they look for the advice in the community. And that's not a bad start, but it's problematic. People always tend to focus on what they have as being the best, and that tends to be what gets regurgitated as being the best. And if something's new, that's always perceived as being better than something that's existing or something that's available elsewhere. I think especially for beginners, the gear is less important than people think oftentimes. I think understanding the gear, how it fits into the market, the various price ranges and whatnot, I think the entire chain is more important, but also each piece is less substantial than people think. People seem to focus far too much on one individual piece in the beginning, and they end up getting 15 or 20 headphones down the road anyways. So I think the better bet is just get what you could afford, what seems to fit your tastes, and just try it. As long as you're not too concerned about the financial risk or the burden, especially if you buy used, a lot of times you could resell for nearly what you paid. So I think just getting into it is a better bet than just focusing on trying to find the right gear, because you're probably not going to get it right the first time, especially if you're a beginner.
If I could offshoot that a little bit, if there was one piece of gear that you think they should start with, is it going to be headphones, or do you think they should start kind of at the headphones first and then work their way down?
Yeah. In my experience, the number one thing that matters to people is the headphone, and it seems to make more of a difference for most. So getting that right is definitely the best start.
So Abyss uses planar drivers in all of their headphones, or transducers, whatever you want to call them. So what are the upsides of a dynamic and electrostatic drivers that planars don't have? And why do you go with planars in the end?
I think the conventional dynamic drivers actually have quite a lot of advantages, but they have a huge disadvantage as well. For them, prototyping is extremely difficult and expensive in comparison. If you're actually doing a ground-up driver, it's very difficult to try 50 different things or to make some custom exotic alloy or some weird material for your diaphragm, your driver membrane. Whereas with planar magnetic and electrostatics, it's comparatively easier. There's fewer barrier to entries there. There's less moving parts. So that's part of the reason why you see boutique manufacturers typically focusing on planar magnetic. But in addition to that, planar magnetic affords you much more leverage to be able to tailor it to your exact tastes. You could do more that influences the sound. with a electrostatic, it's very easy to make a good sounding driver, but it's very difficult to make one that excels beyond the remainder of the electrostatics that are already on the market. So if you want to make something electrostatic and exceptional, that's very, very difficult. There's so little you could do to improve that due to the weak nature of the electrostatic force. There's not much you could do to improve the driving characteristics aside from making the diaphragm lighter. Where something like a planar magnetic, which is what we use, planar magnetics, there's huge ability to tailor all the different materials, the substrates, the magnet, the design to change the sound totally radically. Like I'm sure you've heard quite a great deal of planar magnetics, and they can all sound quite different. And I think it gives you the right balance between tailoring the sound to what you want to hear and being reasonable enough in a small to medium volume manufacture. Because conventional drivers, they kind of only work well in large scale manufacturing. And the boutique stuff it just doesn't sell enough for that to be practical.
If you guys were to go like crazy large scale, would you move to dynamic or stick with planar?
That's a tough one. Planar magnetic is comparatively more difficult to ship in very high volume. It's difficult to make very consistently at high volume in a mass production type setting like you would normally see. So I think we would probably try to maintain planar magnetic, but it is difficult. It depends on the number of units. You're talking millions, it's probably not feasible unless you're just making a very below average planar magnetic. But I think we would try.
And then you have to worry about like product consistency and all that fun stuff.
It's a big challenge.
So how much of the sound is actually produced by the driver and how much is shaped by the pads, baffle, and chassis?
Well, the vast majority is the driver. It depends kind of on the design, but for us at least, I would say 80-85% of the sound, somewhere in that range, is responsible for the driver itself and the design of the driver. The pads are probably a big bulk of the remainder. The housing doesn't matter that much, but that's kind of how we do things. We try to let the driver be critically damped in free air, and the housing actually doesn't implement much towards that. The housing just kind of allows the driver to function, and the idea is it should get out of the way. The pads are not really absolutely as critical as people suspect in terms of sound. The pads are really more of a feel thing, and oddly enough, it's been somewhat apparent that people's perceptions of sound, they vary quite dramatically based on the feel of the ear pads on their head, where they rest on their ears, how they touch their head. That matters a lot to people, and it impacts their perception of the sound. So from like an absolute perspective, it doesn't make as big of a difference as you might suspect. The materials on the ear pad certainly play a major role, but the actual design, the shape, the fit matters a lot less than people suspect. Without a doubt, the driver is the critical piece.
From the engineering side, assuming that we make no further progress in driver technology, how close are we to the perfect headphone?
So if you asked me this a few years ago, I would have had a different answer. This one is difficult. It seems inevitable that things continue to improve. And with planar magnetics especially, I think there's more room for improvement than other designs. There's a great deal of things that have been advancing slowly over time that allow you to get closer to that perfect driver, that allow the driver to start and stop nearly instantaneously. And you could tune the thing so dramatically to your tastes. It's hard to say what really is perfect, especially with our headphone where it's tunable on your head like that, like the 1266. It's made to fit loose on your head. And the way it fits on your head, it has a pretty big difference in the way it sounds. So for so many people, that enables them to get really close to the perfect sound already for them. And advancing past that, that's a tricky one to say because there's no doubt technical advancements could be made. However, you're running against a finite limitation. You have a human on the other end, and humans, well, their hearing probably isn't getting better as time goes on. So I think in general, there's definitely somewhere to go, but I think the remainder of the electronics, the system, that's what has more of an impact right now on the sound. I think the headphone is not that far off. There's that last little bit left for sure, but the electronics, the DACS, the amps, even the cabling, the power conditioning to some extent, that seems to have more of an impact on people's perception of sound than what's left in the headphone space. But this one's fickle because in two-channel audio especially, it's readily apparent. People will spend obscene amounts of money tracing that, just trying to get that 0.01% of performance. And to some people, it's clear that that matters a great deal. That last tiny little trivial bit that most people can't even hear is all that matters to some people because they're so laser focused on this one aspect of the sound and they can't get it anywhere else. That to them, it's actually substantial. So to those people, I would say that there's a fair bit to go. But in general, to the average person, I think we're close. And it seems likely within 10 or 20 years, the benefits will certainly be diminishing. But, people have said this before, and who's to say what the future holds?
Aside from your own company, are there any headphones that stand out as being really good consumer options?
I think there's a few that I find interesting. What stood out early on to me was the 99 Classics from Meza. Those, I like the build on those. I thought when those came out, they had a really interesting build for the time. That was before people were really focusing on these things quite so much. The way they're built, I think, is remarkable in that price point. And other than that, I think the Odyssey LCD2 Classics, I think they're good value. I think they're pretty good headphones. It seems like a pretty compelling option in that price range at least.
So I noticed in the measurements of the 1266, there's a bit of a bass shelf where leading up to certain frequencies, it's a little bit higher and then it almost drops off immediately into sort of the mid-range area. And I know that you guys do this on purpose, but I'm wondering what that purpose is.
So the 1266 was tailored to sound like a two-channel system. And because of that, that's effectively trying to represent the room gain you typically get in those lower frequencies. And it seems to be, from our perspective at least, that most people actually prefer that. I think really it's just that's the sound we were going for on that headphone, and people find it to just be fun and engaging and help them enjoy their music. And it's more representative of what you experience with a two-channel system.
Okay, so this last one's going to be a fun one. What do you think is the most prominent bunch of BS that audio companies give consumers?
There's a lot of that.
Right?
It's very different from this perspective, right? As the manufacturer, you understand typically why manufacturers are saying what they're saying. They're usually trying to mislead consumers, unfortunately. And there's a great deal of things that are they're just sucked in absolutely by consumers. They just see this stuff and they think it's amazing. They want more of it.
Shoot me the top two. What you got?
Okay. I think the biggest issue people have in like the low to mid range, they look at frequency response and they tend to think that that's super relevant. In my experience, it barely matters. Whatever the manufacturer is telling you, a lot of times it's misleading. So the numbers they give you might not be accurate. And even if they are, they don't necessarily indicate whether or not you're going to have a good experience with this one. But we see people occasionally emailing us and asking us, hey, what's the frequency response and how does it compare to this headphone or whatever, things of that nature. And it doesn't provide a lot of value to the consumer. I think that's very misleading. Now, that's a problem, and it certainly isn't an issue to disclose this. It's just the standards don't seem to be set in such a way that they're repeatable a lot of times. And that's very problematic. And in addition to that, the THD. Some people claim...
I was just talking about this.
Some people claim THD measurements that are implausible, and that makes it difficult for other manufacturers to be honest. And so as a result, it doesn't happen. So if you go to independently measure the THD of a headphone, it varies considerably at times from what the manufacturer publishes. And this is complicated because it's not necessarily that the manufacturer is trying to be deceptive. It could just be that they're trying to say a number that's going to be received by the reader as representative of the performance. Yeah. But if everyone else is lying, well, you kind of have to lie as well. Otherwise, you look horrible if you're being honest.
Yeah. I mean, like every headphone box ever lately, it seems, has sub 1% distortion. And if you came at it being like sub 15%
Right.
distortion,
Nobody would buy it.
You'd be like way
Yeah.
behind everybody else. Yeah, I actually talk about this in this
Okay.
in this video, like specifically of how like amp and DAC measurements are usually a little bit more precise, and that the measurement on the box in terms of THD specifically is basically like it's foo-foo. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay, I'm glad we agree on that. All right, man. I appreciate your time, Eric.
I appreciate
Thanks
you.
a lot. And I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Advanced level headphones. These are your headphones that come in at your end game sound qualities and at your end game prices. Now, I want to make a quick note here about end game headphones like this. I have not come across a headphone that is the best of any headphone at every single category, but I have noticed that up in this upper echelon of prices, you usually find the best of specific categories. So if you want the best build or the best bass or the best treble or the best this or that, this is the area to look. AB1266. This is simply put one of the most advanced planar magnetic headphones on the market today. It also is built like an absolute tank. Regarding sound quality, I think that this headphone is the most complete of any headphone in the past decade, and I highly recommend it. It was my headphone of the year for 2020. Sennheiser HE1. This is probably the single best electrostatic headphone on the market today. Unfortunately, you can't buy just the headphone, you have to get the entire system. And while it sounds wonderful, the price will make you cry. $59,000. ZMF Verite. ZMF has some of the best dynamic headphones that are on the market today. They feature boutique styling and a wonderful sound. I think their peak performance that I've come across is going to be with the Verite. Odyssey LCD24. Not many have heard of it. I never got the chance to review this thing, but it has been one of the most enjoyable headphones that I have had the pleasure of listening to. Sometimes these, like, they sound really good in my head, and then I spit them out, and they're just like, what the fuck are you talking about, bro?
Favorite non-audio distortion delivery device? Sorry.
I think you just gave me an aneurysm. And then I felt like an idiot because I'm like, I should know what he's talking about, but I have no clue what he's talking about. I mean, it sucks when like the crust sucks or like the cheese is all like sugary and, you know,
Exactly.
like, yeah. I'm gonna put most of this in the bloopers, talking about pizza specifics.